Looking back, I feel quite foolish. In fact, I should have realized my own foolishness. The flat was far too cheap to be appropriate, even for a studio. I ought to have understood that there must have been a catch. The day I moved in felt like a total dream, so I insisted that nobody help me. I didn't want my relatives to suspect anything about my personality. By the end of the day, all of my muscles ached terribly. As my head throbbed, I fell back onto the mattress, looking up at the sky from my bare bed. My eyes were hazy, and I pulled the damp hair away from my forehead, wincing at the discomfort. I was disgusted when someone knocked on my door, making me jump. I swore under my breath as I raised myself up on my elbows, realizing that I had mistakenly left the door open. Ignoring the old college rule that if you wish to make peace, you should leave your door open, I didn't feel like making new friends. Two young women were standing there, one of whom was an Asian woman. The other had jagged black hair and was smiling at me, while someone else stood a bit farther back, grasping a Marlboro package. "Hey, Reds," she said, nodding at me with a voice that was both smooth and harsh. I relaxed a bit and asked if she had just moved in. I rubbed my face with both hands, deciding not to engage in etiquette. The girls clearly walked in, disregarding my obvious body language. The black-haired girl ran her fingers along the edge of my desk and picked up a small porcelain duck from my unpacked jar of trinkets. I explained how I felt oddly defensive about it. "Defensive cute," she remarked, raising the duck. Suddenly, the other girl looked around and asked, "Has anyone told her yet?" She had a pack of smokes tucked into her jeans back pocket and was pulling at her long red hair. "Give her a moment, Jesus," she added. "She must be aware, but we haven't even—" I blinked at the two of them and asked for her name. To my surprise, I realized I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom. They were chatting and interacting with my things as if I weren't present, and I sincerely just wanted to take a nap. "My name is Gianna," I said, referring to the girl with the red braids who had taken a seat beside me on my bed. They told me to explain what was going on, but of course, they didn't follow any rules. My face went blank again. I was unaware of any rules other than the standard rental ones I had followed when signing the lease. When I glanced at it, the owner was a slender woman with an ashy smell, and I was pretty sure she had never acquired the necessary facial muscles to smile. I wasn't going to follow up with her queries, especially considering how cheap the rent was. With trepidation, the other girl asked where I had moved from. I disregarded her question, feeling an odd, wicked kind of curiosity. Her face was smiling and bouncing a little on my mattress, while the other girl sighed at my discomfort. "Something strange happens here every night," she said loudly, starting to remove my rickety office chair and taking a seat. I sat up and scowled at her. My curiosity finally peaked when I heard Gianna's voice echoing down the street. It reminded me of a camp counselor's frightening tale about a fire. "Burn that one down there," she said, pointing at my window. "Every night, they scream for something different." I was meant to help them, but I merely gazed at her, feeling a little shiver run down my back. I was unsure of how to react to the situation. It was one of those distinct moments when everything felt surreal. Each night, the other girl whispered, "We never know when it's going to happen." She shrugged, almost regretfully, explaining why we were all gathered there. I'm not sure why I sneered, while tilting my elbows against my knees. The girl shrugged again, saying that she didn't have to explain herself. You could see it in her eyes. They convinced me that she seemed sincere, but I was still unable to grasp what they were talking about. The phrase felt true, yet it was also too odd to comprehend. I knew that this wouldn't work. It wasn't the most pleasant area, but it couldn't be so awful that they were pulling a practical joke on me. Gianna, matter-of-factly, said later, "We'll show you," before I could object. She took hold of the other girl's wrist, and they left, so I watched them march down the hallway, talking to one another. After they were gone, I shut my door behind them. As promised, they returned that night, this time with 2 guys in tow. One of them was a bit heavy-set, wearing tight black jeans and a t-shirt, and my eyes were quickly drawn to a heart-shaped silver charm around his neck. He grinned at me and introduced himself as Will. The second guy was smaller, but plump and anxious-looking, dressed in ill-fitting cargo shorts and sporting a buzz cut. I was told that the girl's name was Matteo. Gianna entered with a somewhat crushed box of wine and a pack of smokes. I still hadn't caught the name of the girl who had been with them earlier. She was the only one who even glanced at me. They all sat down on my dusty floor beside the window, and I positioned myself between Will and Gianna, eager to join the conversation. The girl without a name seemed uncertain if I should keep having violations or if I ought to simply give in to the strange pressure of the moment. "Do you all live here, neighbors?" I asked, constructing my thoughts, and grudgingly, I said yes. Will smiled half-heartedly and explained, "This building is where everyone lives. It's where the youths hang out." He added, "Don't let her smoke," pointing at Gianna. "We've all settled in here, so please pardon us," she said, and then she mentioned having some conspiracy theories. "It's not a theory," she glared, raising her voice. Will looked at the others, who were middle-aged people with children, while older folks and grandkids occupied the street across from us. I realized there wasn't a single 20-something in that whole building. Could I look at her too much and be in awe of her? I admired how she tied her long strands of hair and the dark makeup that framed her eyes. It was as if fireworks were blowing up around us, and I felt a strange thrill. "You'll scare her with that wine bottle," I joked, but she merely shrugged at me, apparently unfrightened. We passed the test of initial awkwardness, but she didn't seem to believe me. As the bottle went around, I found it funny to hear them argue and giggle. It was evident that they had all been friends for a while, and it felt like I was intruding on their dynamic, despite the fact that they were in my space. At one point, I was questioned by the rental staff if I had visited the area before. I told him I went to college, but I slipped out of the conversation, and everyone nodded sympathetically, which made me feel foolish. By midnight, I was a bit tipsy and starting to let my guard down. To be honest, having friends around felt nice. I had already accepted in my mind that a life of separation, at least temporarily, must be my fate. I found myself laughing at Jana and Matto's argument over a cigarette while switching between May, who was blowing smoke out of the open window. I had nearly forgotten the reason they were all gathered when suddenly a loud alarm blared. It was an Amber Alert that echoed throughout the town, resonating from hundreds of phones in a dissonant chorus. I almost jumped at the sound, not just from our devices, but from everywhere. I couldn't stop laughing, even as one of them fell silent and turned to face me. I frowned at the screen as I pulled out my phone. "Don't meddle," someone whispered, their eyes nearly glassy. In a quiet, tremulous voice, Matto spoke up. I touched his shoulder and glanced at May, who was deeply furrowed in worry, stealing glances at our group while smoking a cigarette on the windowsill. As the smoke shrank away, a chill spread up my back, making me shudder and sending a tingle over my scalp. Something felt really, really wrong. The others were silent now, just watching. I quietly sat up by the window, feeling somewhat warmer against the breeze, as if something was buzzing around me, or perhaps I was just sweating. We sat motionless for what felt like 30 minutes, and I was tempted to ask what was happening. It was faint and far away at first, but I could still hear the cries that continued to rise in volume. They grew closer and louder with time, and I prayed that someone would come to provide urgent help. I reached out the window, desperate to see it with my own eyes, to verify that someone was out there. From my new room on the 4th floor, it was difficult to discern who was down on the road without squinting. The flickering streetlights allowed me to see the general shape of a figure bent over an old man, aimlessly walking from door to door, wearing what appeared to be hospital attire. The robe did little to conceal his pallid, fractured physique. Behind him was a trail of leaking blood, but I couldn't see where it was coming from. "Please let me know where that came from. I'm hurt," I thought, filled with a sense of dread and urgency. I turned to face the others, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. May touched my arm and exclaimed loudly, "What the devil is happening?" I pulled my arm back, trying to calm myself down. "Please, Arden, let's get away from her," I urged. "Why can't we help him? We can't aid an elderly man who lacks trust," she replied, leaning farther out the window, ready to yell for him. I froze, my mouth opening, but no words coming out. The man down below continued to face our building, his head tilted up. Although I couldn't see his eyes, I felt as if he was staring directly at me, and an icy dread washed over me. "Help me," he whimpered, his voice barely audible in the silent night. Then he began to scream, but it wasn't a human scream. It was the most desperate sound I had ever heard. My gut twisted in pain, and tears welled up in my eyes, but I couldn't look away. Blood was dripping from his arms, or rather, from the places where his arms should have been. All that remained were torn and bloody stumps that looked fresh, and he remained motionless, swaying slightly. His eyes, wide and frantic, didn't leave me, and his screech gradually morphed into words that I could barely comprehend. "Please understand. Could you please pull me back?" I collapsed onto the floor, horrified and in pain, and yelled out the window, "What is that creature?" I hadn't meant to whisper, but that was all that came out. "We don't know," May replied, her gaze fixed on Will, who was sobbing while Matto clung to him tightly. "We just know that he might fall over." "Adhere to the regulations and the effects of breaking them?" I asked, but immediately regretted it. The old man wept softly outside, and GI went over to close the window. However, that did nothing to diminish the heart-stopping sound. "Do you want to share it with her, or should I ask Will?" Will simply shook his head, clutching the small locket that was now spinning in his hands. Matto groaned, his fingers trembling as he turned to me. One of them reached for Shannon, Will's girlfriend. Gian made her start, he murmured, and I swallowed hard. Shannon, I'm sorry. Her name is Shannon. I tried to push down the knot in my throat, but it wouldn't budge. Mato shook his head, bewildered by what had happened. We were all present when the yelling began, yet we usually just brushed it off. Now that we knew it was useless to ignore, we couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, it seemed, she had seen something strange. She ran off, insisting she had to help, and we were unable to stop her. Will glanced over, silent, but the yelling outside had begun to fade down the street, farther away than it had been. Shannon simply shrugged, saying nothing, and I tried to clamp my lips together, fighting against the rising panic inside me. In order to make sense of everything, I truly thought they were trying to trick me, but I had seen it with my own eyes, and I was terrified. Why doesn't somebody leave? I wondered, but all I got in response was a shrug. Some people just didn't care anymore, or perhaps they couldn't afford to leave. We had all signed a non-disclosure agreement along with the lease, ensuring that no one would speak about what went on here. I scowled as I recalled the moment I had signed the papers, trying to remember if I had really understood what I was agreeing to. I vaguely remembered being able to visualize what the document contained, but I had thought it was filled with legal jargon that I would never comprehend. Had I truly signed a non-disclosure agreement without even knowing it? I told them I needed time to think before going to bed, and they all seemed to understand, bidding me farewell as they left. Lying alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I found my thoughts drifting to May's face. I remembered how she had extinguished the smoke and moved away from the window. Eventually, I managed to drift off to sleep, but the following weeks were hard. I struggled to get restful sleep, spending increasing amounts of time with my new neighbors. I learned that there were indeed people over 30 living in our building, even if I rarely saw them. Settling in next door was challenging. The other residents seemed so worn down, clearly afraid of whatever haunted the place. You could tell they had been here for a long time. They kept their blinds closed and often moaned softly, concentrating on whatever they were doing. I eventually started to imitate them, finding it somewhat helpful to act as though everything was normal, strange as that sounds. Going out wasn't really an option for me. I had dropped out of college and hadn't secured a job yet, so I was living off the money I had saved. Each night, a different person would come and go. Some looked more human, while others I wasn't sure if I believed in anything anymore. May and I spent most of our time together, often sitting on the front steps where people were smoking. It felt odd to watch them, especially at night when everything seemed so macabre and sinister. The neighborhood was bright and lively in the afternoon, but the dark brought with it an unsettling atmosphere. We rarely spoke about the regulations that governed our lives there, and I found comfort in simply relishing each other's company during those quiet moments. I was starting to feel at ease when everything changed with the arrival of a birthday celebration. "Happy birthday," the others called out as May entered the room. Mato blasted into a plastic party horn, the sound echoing through the space. May's hand flew to the side of her head in surprise. "Jesus Christ, you know I hate surprises," she exclaimed, which made Gi laugh as she moved over to May, holding a haphazard chocolate cake covered in bright pink frosting and sprinkles. "Happy birthday, May," was written in the center of the cake. They placed the cake on the dresser, and Gi put her arm around May's neck. "What does that do?" May asked, feigning annoyance, but I could see the smile tugging at her lips. Matto cut in. "Enough of this. Let's share some cake." He moved between them, and I felt a pang of nostalgia for the birthday celebrations I used to have, going out to bars and celebrating with friends. They told me there was no strict curfew in place, just a recommendation to be home by 10:30 p.m. Usually, they claimed to return home either after sleeping through the night or before the alarm went off. We all got some cake and moved to the kitchen, where the boys were firing off jokes and laughter as they pre-gamed. I watched as Gianna fumbled with May's hair, trying to style it for the occasion. I had never been a big party animal. Back in college, I often found myself talking out back with the smokers while the real party happened inside. I had never been a fan of friend groups either, but perhaps this situation was different. Suddenly, I noticed everyone trooping outside, and I crammed myself into Matteo's car. The back seat was cramped, and I was squeezed against the others. I felt the car door strike my shoulder as I settled in. Matteo turned up the volume on his music, and the beat pulsed through the car, filling the space with a sense of excitement and camaraderie that I hadn't felt in a long time. Despite the strange circumstances surrounding our lives, for a moment, I felt a flicker of joy and connection. The small room was filled with the smell of tobacco and various other odors, which hurt my ears as we raced down the roadway, heading toward the city. However, despite the discomfort, it was actually quite pleasant. Really pleasant. I found myself sharing in the laughter of those around me, encircling May with my arm when she playfully weaseled her way closer. Her hand rested comfortably under my arm, and everything felt truly lovely, just as I had expected from the bars we were visiting. I wasn't particularly keen on making choices, but this time, instead of heading to college, I decided to go along with the flow. I followed my friends out and took pictures, even dancing beneath the low-hanging smoke that filled the air. Purple flashes of light danced around me, lasting until my feet hit the floor. My clunky pumps were surely tainted with blisters by the time we reached the third bar, but I could no longer feel them. We were crowded inside, and we decided to enter a retro photo booth. Reluctantly, Gianna slipped a $5 bill into the slot, and we burst into laughter as the pictures developed. The others moved about the room, but I found myself momentarily lost in the red shades of the lighting. Just then, May took hold of my wrist, stopping me in my tracks. She raised her baby blue, long nails, and I shuddered at the touch. "I never got a birthday present from you," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool air. If I had been wearing my glasses, my face would have fogged up from the warmth of the moment. It was pleasant before she kissed me, and afterward, I found myself wondering if Will would call out to me. Navigating through a group of guys wearing torn leather jackets, I blinked and glanced around, realizing that I was unsure of where everyone else had gone. "What's up, Del?" I shrugged when I finally spotted him breaking free from the swaying mass of bodies. He looked worried. His face was red, and I could see sweat trickling down. He pulled his phone from his pocket and extended it to me. When I glanced at his home screen, I noticed a picture of him beside a strawberry blonde girl, both looking happy and holding beer bottles. He asked me to stay until 1:47 in the morning, explaining that it was getting late and we needed to find the others. I realized he was becoming anxious as the clock approached 1 a.m. and there was still no sign of them. The bars would likely stay open later than usual, but he wanted to return. As Will and I had previously weaved through the crowd, I felt a surge of excitement, only to become aware that I was suffering from the discomfort of my shoes. Changing my foot placement only brought a sense of shame. Was I really that much of a drinker? Eventually, we found our friends outside the bar, looking lightweight and relaxed. The act of smoking seemed to clarify the situation for them, and as we prepared for the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had impacted me in an odd way. Mateo's tight music was abruptly silenced, leaving no room for laughter or loud chatter as we drove along, feeling an unsettling tension in the air. We all sensed it, a claim that something was amiss. Will drove quickly, almost dangerously, veering off the road as he sped around the final bend. My hand was taken by dark May, and together we strained to see the outline of our housing block across the street. Suddenly, all of our phones rang at once, causing Gianna to let out a little shriek from the opposite side of the back seat. Matto turned back to us, putting his finger to his mouth in a gesture for silence. Had this ever happened before? I didn't believe it, but things felt different now. I recalled the times I had been in my bedroom, able to simply close the curtains and put on my headphones, feeling powerless and insignificant, as if I were peering into something incomprehensible. In that moment, we all felt like flies caught in the web of a spider, and the web seemed to be tightening around us. Will slowed down to about 5 miles per hour, and the silence was palpable. Not even a stray breath broke through the stillness. The bright street lights illuminated the scene, casting eerie shadows. Will's face was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knee moving as he slammed on the brakes, I might have mistaken him for a car mannequin. My eyes remained glued to him as we crept down the dark street. Then I saw what Will saw, a silhouette in the distance. It was too far away to discern its shape, but it clearly moved with a shaky, anthropomorphic stagger, limping in the middle of the road. In the overpowering silence, I could hear the distant plea for help, and I felt an urgent need to act before Gianna hissed at us to do something. Will stayed motionless, staring ahead, his expression as white as paper, devoid of any logical response. I knew it was too late. We were frozen in place. As the figure drew closer, I realized it was a girl, her stature and voice confirming my suspicion. She wore some kind of white nightgown, reminiscent of old hospital clothes, smeared with dark red blood. I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dried, but for some reason, that detail felt significant. May mumbled beside me, her arm trembling against mine, urging us to duck down so we wouldn't be seen. In our hearts, the bleakness of the situation felt heavy, yet it also seemed logical to follow her lead. I nodded and crouched behind the passenger seat, my knees sore from the awkward position I had contorted myself into. We all followed suit, except for Will, who remained motionless, simply gazing ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, heavy with the weight of the word Shannon. It hung in the air, hinting that Matto was the one who had shattered the silence surrounding us. He reiterated what Shannon had said, finally turning to look at his companion, who was now coming into view. I squinted from the front seat, trying to make sense of the figure approaching us. It was then that I noticed the round, strawberry blonde hair and the familiar face. Shannon, Will's girl, the one who appeared on his phone lock screen. Next to me, May gasped as the figure seemed to shimmer, almost vanishing before our eyes. Maddo spoke slowly, his words hanging in the air. "Dude, I get what you're thinking. Do not leave this place." Will, however, didn't seem to be present. He looked shock-stricken, lost in a daze. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to help her. The desperate cries echoed in my mind as I called out, "Please, someone help me." The sound stung as it drew closer, filling the air with a sense of dread. The cries grew louder, and I felt compelled to act, reliving some of life's harsh lessons in that instant. Maddo shook his head and grabbed his sleeve, a silent plea for me to reconsider. "I know you miss her, but please don't do it," he urged, tears welling in my eyes. The voices became clearer, increasingly frantic, and I felt Gianna trembling beside me, though I couldn't see her from my position. The figure was halfway to our car now, turning her head left and right, as if trying to absorb the air around her. My heart raced. I felt as if it might burst from my chest. As the figure came closer, I finally saw Shannon's face, but it was a horrific sight. Her features were covered in gore, and her eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets. She sobbed, drooling, her mouth open but unable to produce a sound. Why had everything escalated so quickly? I struggled against Maddo's grip as he tried to keep me from tearing my arm away. "GI," he yelled, attempting to force the car door open, but he missed. I managed to get the door open before he could try again. I stumbled out, hitting the pavement with a soft crunch. Shannon twisted her head, letting out a scream, but instead of charging at Will, she extended her arms in front of her, as if she were afraid of being harmed. She whipped her head around, and suddenly a warning sound pierced the air. One I had heard before, but was now far too overwhelming. The streetlights on either side of the road flickered to a red flashing hue. Maddo flung himself into the driver's seat, and as he peeled away, the tires screeched against the asphalt. Gianna was yelling and screaming at him from the back, and when he looked back, May was crying into her hands. I sat frozen, my hands still, unable to make a sound. I didn't understand what was happening as we drove off, but I couldn't help but glance back at the scene. In the bright red light, I caught a glimpse of something, a car of some kind, turning the corner, and then, suddenly, there was nothing. It's been a week or two since that night, and I find it hard to keep track of time. None of us have spoken much since then. We tried calling the cops that night, but as expected, nothing came of it. I believe whatever happened is far bigger than we understand. I'm not sure if it was a strange game or some sort of experiment, but I plan to return to my parents' house next week, despite their criticisms, and decide what to do from there. I still grapple with the question of whether Shannon was truly there that evening, or if it was something else entirely. The thought of it all is unsettling, but the worst part is that last night, I heard Will's voice outside my window, calling out for help. I didn't cry or beg for assistance. I just listened, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on me.